Well, hello everyone. I think you're here and you can hear me. And of course, um, you've all muted your microphones, so I assume you're there. But so this is our short class, and so that I don't forget. And again, I'm using Zoom. I used it, of course, on Friday, and I'm getting back into the routine of using Zoom. So let me go ahead, so I don't forget to do it. To share the screen and go. Of course, now I have to open up the. So stop. Let me see. Let me go back here and go to the cyber campus so we can do the attendance and go to cyber campus, make sure open up cyber campus, go back to Zoom. And there you see there, okay, go to share. And there you see the cyber campus. So I go to attendance and we go to week 6, and week 6 is here. Click on smart attendance, and your smart attendance number is 736. 736 is your smart attendance number. So let me then go back to stop the share, and then go back to chats and put in 736 in the chat box. So it's out there for everybody. And so that we can dispense with that. And of course, we're now talking about the member states, and but it's really important to talk about the member states because they are really the driving force. The cooperation among the member states is really the driving force behind the European Union, as reflected in that liberal intergovernmentalist perspective or framework or theoretical viewpoint that we covered at the beginning in the first chapters of the book, in terms of trying to explain what's driving the European Union. And of course, if we go here to member states, let me open up the notes for member states, and you can see. Let me again go back to Zoom. So I have to go to Zoom, and then I have to go back to the notes that I just opened. Of course, these are the notes of the member states that you have already for your paragraph that's due on Thursday. And so, yeah, that means, of course, on Thursday that we will be back to on Friday we'll be back to meeting in the classroom. So what I was showing you when we started here was a speech by Margaret Thatcher. And let's see if I can find that so you can see. Let me see, stop share, and of course, show you this again. Go back to this video from, I think it's from 1990. So it's right before the end of Margaret Thatcher's government, and she's been in power since 1979. And here you can see she's referencing to how she's opposed to the joining what was going to become the European Union. Now, of course, in 1990, it was still the European Community, and um, and but in the 1980s, when during her time in office, many changes were happening in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, of course, had lots and lots of problems, which are getting lots and lots, much worse in its economic performance. And finally, in the mid 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union, and he began instituting reforms. And it was interesting because she was, of course, Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, and Francois Mitterrand was the president of France, and Helmut Kohl was the chancellor, the prime minister of what was then West Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany, but was just West Germany because East Germany was communist. And they began reacting to what was going on in the Soviet Union by accelerating European economic integration. She supported the move towards the Single European Act. The Single European Act was a decision made in the mid 1980s to really begin to accelerate and move forward with the creation of a single market. the creation of a single market. So if I go back here to my, if I can get this out of the way here, the Single European Act. Let's see, can I get this out of the way? I can't move this little box. If I could just move this little box so I could get out of the way here, so I can get back to my. Well, that's strange. So no, I don't want that. So we go back here, um, stop share, and then we go back here to that box I had open here. So yeah, here we go. So let me open up this my Gemini account, Gemini on Google, just to look up the Single European Act. So we go here. Just a second. Let me go back to Zoom so you can see what I'm doing here. Share screen. You can see I'm at the Gemini. So share, and we'll type in the single. What was the Single European Act? And Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain, was really supportive of this, right? The Single European Act was the first major revision of the 1957 Treaty of Rome, which created the European Economic Community, right? And it was signed in '86 in Luxembourg and came in, and it entered into force in 1987. And it moved to establish a single market, that very important single market, right? Free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor among member states by December 31, 1992. So there were a lot of reasons why the European economic integration accelerated. But one of the reasons was because the leaders of Western Europe, including Margaret Thatcher and Francois Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl, they wanted to respond to what was exciting, really important, exciting developments and maybe dangerous developments in the Soviet Union when Mikhail Gorbachev really wanted to carry out reforms, and Europe had to meet the challenge of responding to major changes happening in the Soviet Union. And of course, we know that by December 31, 1991, the Soviet Union would disintegrate, would disappear. In 1989, of course, the communism ended in Eastern Europe. The communist regimes fell in Eastern Europe when Mikhail Gorbachev signaled very clearly to Europe and the world that he was not going to order the Soviet military to keep in power the communist regimes in places like East Germany and Hungary. And when that became clear that he wasn't going to enforce the communist government's rule in Eastern Europe, they collapsed, right? And then, of course, a couple of years later, the Soviet Union itself would collapse. So, but then, of course, when it became clear that these changes were intensifying, that of course changes were happening in the Soviet Union, that there was the danger of war in Yugoslavia at this time, which wasn't really a surprise. I mean, people have been predicting that Yugoslavia might break up into war break up violently for a long time. The European Union leaders wanted to go for the European community leaders wanted to go further and create a European Union and move forward with more economic integration with economic and monetary union. And there you see her complaining against that, rejecting that she wanted to was opposed to creating let me see if I go back, creating a European Union with a single currency through economic and monetary union. And then, of course, what's important is that, of course, soon after this speech, she gives the speech, she's removed from power. She's removed from power in Great Britain, and there was not an election to remove her. It was a decision made by the leadership of the Conservative Party. They're also called the Tories. That she had to go, and since they removed her as the leader of the Conservative Party, she was therefore no longer could be Prime Minister of Great Britain, because the Prime Minister is the person who can control the majority of the votes in the House of Commons. That person has the right to be Prime Minister in the informal constitution of the United Kingdom. It's not really written down anywhere in a constitution, but it's part of the informal right. So when they moved her as the head of the Conservative Party, under the other leaders, top leaders, she could not be prime minister, and she was replaced by, if I could find a picture of him, I don't know if I can see it here. You can see him maybe if I move forward here, John Major, and you can barely see him. That's John Major behind her, right? He would replace her, and this all happened in the early 1990s. And um, but I wanted to tell you, of course, that among people that support United Kingdom leaving the European Union, which they did finally in 2020, she is considered one of the greatest leaders of Great Britain since Winston Churchill, right? Since Winston Churchill. And but she's controversial because, of course, people who oppose United Kingdom leaving the European Union thinks, of course, that it was a great mistake, but that she boosted greatly this effort to leave the European Union because she gave this speech. And one of the reasons why she was removed by the leadership of the Conservative Party was her opposition, her hostility to the European integration. Her hostility to further European integration was one of, not the only reason, but was one of the reasons as to why the other leaders in the Conservative Party moved against her and removed her as leader of the Conservative Party, and therefore forced her to step down as leader of the as prime minister. And of course, she was replaced by this man, John Major, whom you can't really see very well in their background. And then he would call an election, I think in 1992. I'd have to go back and check, but of course, this was one of the reasons why she was removed, was because she was too hostile to the European Union, to European integration. And she died not too long ago, of course. But again, as evidence about how important she is to the British people. For example, I don't know if any of you ever seen this film. I watched this film. Let me just open up the Wikipedia page for it here and stop share and go back to sharing the screen. And you can see this was a film that came out in 2011 called The Iron Lady. And that's, of course, Meryl Streep is the actress playing Margaret Thatcher, and it came out in 2011. And of course, it's entertaining, but just to show you that she must be really admired to this day by many people. I think she died not too long ago, before the pandemic. She died before the pandemic, but I think, yeah, she died certainly after this film came out. And of course, she was called the Iron Lady because I think Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, he called her the Iron Lady. And that's how she got that nickname, the Iron Lady, from Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union. But again, just to highlight how this process of European integration accelerated in the 1980s, partly in response to the perception in London and in Paris and in Bonn. Bonn was the capital of West Germany before Germany reunited the two sides and they moved the capital back to Berlin, that they needed to respond to these momentous changes that were clearly occurring or underway in the Soviet Union. And I guess some lessons to draw from that, or impressions to draw from that, of course, that the European leadership today, they see lots of changes happening, revolutionary changes happening in Russia again today, in a dangerous direction, obviously, in a very bleak negative direction. And that, of course, is also further encouraging the leaders of the European Union today, which does not include the United Kingdom, to accelerate further the process of European integration. Not so much focusing directly on economics, but on security policy, and the political economy of the economic integration necessary to support developing a stronger autonomous European military and industrial capacities, a stronger European industrial base that can support a European armaments industry to supply a European military capability, right? Again, building upon the process of European integration up until this point that has been so heavily focused upon single market, economic integration. And so one of the themes I wanted to go back to highlight this, of course, is since we're also a political science class, right, we should be introducing you to theoretical frameworks for understanding this process. Is if I go back to, I have to go back to Gemini here just a second. So I go back to Gemini, and then I go back to Zoom, and then I go back to share. There you can see, oh, there it is. So I think you can see, there it is, Gemini. So you can see in the past, I looked up this concept of incrementalism. If I can find it here, incrementalism. So I scroll down a bit here, and yeah, models of incremental policy making. So I looked this up in the past, and so if I go back here to um, um, incrementalism. So I scroll up here, and just to show you, this is lots of this is European, yes, concept of incrementalism. So I asked, define incrementalism in public policy making. This is what I asked Gemini right here. And it says incrementalism in public policymaking is a political science theory that suggests policy change occurs in small successive steps rather than through large scale comprehensive reforms. So, in other words, you build upon what you already have. In responding to these crises, and remember, European integration is largely driven by responding to crises confronting Europe. You build upon what already exists. And so you see how, as the European Union today is trying to respond to the military challenges and threats perceived from Russia, that it's building upon the single market. So that means it's this big focus upon we have to build up the economic capacities to support a military infrastructure, right? And that means building upon what already exists to adapt it, to modify it, to respond to a new problem or an escalating problem or an intensifying problem. Why? Why did they do that? Because it's politically feasible. It's something you can do. You've got thousands of people already oriented towards creating a single market, right? So now we need to create a single market in armaments production, right? We need to create a single market in ammunition production. We need to create a single framework for well, now what do they want to create? They want to say, well, they want to create a drone wall, right, to protect eastern flank of the European Union, including Poland and the Baltic states and Bulgaria. They have to create a wall to protect from drones from coming from Russia, right? So that means they gotta come up with a single framework, a common framework for integrating drone production and coordinating drone production. And they're familiar with that because they've already been doing that and creating a single market for many years, many decades, right? So that reflects incrementalism, right? You build upon what already exists to adapt it and modify it a little bit or to some degree to make it fit a new problem, right? So that's concepts of incrementalism. It says remedial and serial is focused on, yeah, the process of policy making is focused on correcting or improving existing policies to address specific immediate problems, right? So, and that's why, as the European Union tries to become a more important actor in foreign and security policy, and also in internal immigration policy, and integrating police enforcement against smuggling, against fraud, against counterfeiting the euro, for example. They use the base built upon creating the single market, and that really strong focus upon the community method that we described earlier, the community method. In other words, qualified majority voting in the council, right? When the ministers of the member states meet, whether the agricultural ministers or the financial and economic ministers or all of the different formations of the Council of the European Union, the Council of Ministers, that they want to ideally move in the direction of qualified majority voting, partly because that's what you have to do if you actually want to get something decided in the name of the European Union, rather than try to get all 27 member states to agree, right? So I just wanted to highlight that in terms of this focus upon incrementalism, and just keep that, and that's a general rule, not just of Europe, but of governments in general. If there's a new problem confronting the French government or the South Korean government or the American government, they're going to use what tools they already have in terms of bureaucracies, in terms of agencies, in terms of institutional capabilities. They're going to use what they already have and try to adapt what they already have to address that new problem that might not be directly in that original focus of the purpose of that tool, right? And so, how is this relevant, for example, to the United States? Well, the United States has this big, vast military infrastructure. It's created all over the world with hundreds and hundreds of military bases. So, and it's the biggest non-discretionary part of the U.S. government's up to $1 trillion a year in terms of the money the U.S. spends just on the U.S. Defense Department, right? That the U.S. is probably going to be oriented towards using its military capacities to address problems that it confronts around the world. Why? Because that's what most of its tools are, military type tools that it's created over many, many, many years, involving hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people, if you include the people in the armed services, right? And so that's just the nature of policy. It's typically incremental because that's what politicians can politically feasibly, more feasibly do, right? And so just to keep that in mind because that's an important point. But we're talking with the member states here. But again, I also mentioned the last class about how nationalism and all the classes about how nationalism is such an important part of the challenge of European integration because it's not going to go away. So you want nationalism ideally to be an ally of European integration. If you're a Bulgarian nationalist or Polish nationalist, ideally the European Union leadership, originally based in Western Europe, before the Cold War ended, they want you to view, if you want to be a good Pole, you want to be a good European Polish person or a good Bulgarian Polish person, right? A good European Polish person, a good European Bulgarian person. That's what you want to do with European integration is you want to make it an ally of European nationalisms, of the nationalisms of the member states, because it's not going to go away. And if we don't try to exploit it and control it, somebody else will. And you see the rise of these Eurosceptic and European hostile parties that were so important that they led to the British leaving the European Union. So, but here I mentioned the last class how Nigel Farage has finally, after 7 or 8 times running for House of Commons. So yes, let's go back to Gemini here, and I go back to Gemini. Was I already at Gemini? I shouldn't have done it. Okay, we go back to Gemini. Let's ask Gemini. Gemini, how many times has Nigel Farage run for election, to the UK House of Commons? And I must have been 7 or 8 times, right? And he never succeeded until 8 times, right? And you can see he lost United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP. Finally, he got into the House of Commons in 2024. But previously, he had won and been a member in the European Parliament. And I showed you that video of him mocking the first president of the European Council, the former Belgian Prime Minister Herman van Rompuy, calling him he looked like a second banker with the charisma of a damp washcloth and insulting typical Nigel Farage behavior. But I also then wanted to show you how Herman van Rompuy responded, and I couldn't find that video last time, but now of course I did find it. So here's Herman van Rompuy responding in French to Nigel Farage. So let me stop share here and go back to share and go here, and you can see Herman van Rompuy responding in French. And I know we have some French speakers here. So you see, this is in 2010. This is during the sovereign debt crisis. and after he had just assumed his position as president of the European Council, and he's highlighting how Europe failed to deal with the financial crisis 70 years ago. So 70 years ago would be if this 2010, so it'd be 1930, right? 1930, and that of course was the Great Depression that came as a consequence of countries not cooperating, not, in fact, putting up barriers to trade and trying to keep out imports and competitively devaluing their currencies. The same kind of language and concerns you still hear in Korea, for example, that South Koreans sometimes are suspicious that the Japanese government is purposely trying to drive down the value of the Japanese yen to make Japanese yen cheaper compared to the Korean won, so that they're by making the yen less valuable, that Japanese exports become cheaper because you can buy them with fewer dollars because the Japanese yen is worth less. So the U.S. dollar buys more, and so Japanese products become cheaper when they sell them in America because the Japanese yen becomes cheaper. So that the Japanese government is manipulating the value of the Japanese yen on currency markets so that they get an unfair advantage for Sanyo, Japanese electronics, at the expense of selling Samsung competing in the Samsung products competing in the U.S. market. You still hear that. I've seen that in English language media, the suspicion, right? So he's saying, we did not do this. This is 15 years ago. We're not doing that, making that mistake like we made in 1930. And that's a good point, by the way. I forgot about that until I started seeing this, because now Google has this nice translation function that works pretty nicely on everything that you hear. Um, During the global financial crisis 15 years ago, there was a lot of concern that the world could fall back into a Great Depression unless they cooperated and coordinated their economic policies, which they did. The United States, the People's Republic of China, the Japanese central bank, the American central bank, the European central bank, all of them cooperated, including the Chinese central bank, to make sure that there was enough liquidity, financial resources put into the system to prevent the financial system from collapsing and the Great Recession becoming another Great Depression. And that was evidence of progress. So we had actually learned from our mistakes in the 1930s not to do that again. Like, yeah, see, we all learned that we have to save the economic system. That Beijing, London, Washington, I guess Moscow, I don't know. I mean, Tokyo, Seoul, we all have to, the Europeans, we all have to do that. And of course, I remember thinking that, evidence of learning, evidence of progress. And now, of course, I'm just thinking about the fact, oh my God, Donald Trump got elected in 2016 and then reelected in 2024. And I'm not certain that this would happen again, this kind of cooperation to prevent a global economic catastrophe, another global Great Depression, and the consequences politically that included the rise of Hitler in Germany amidst the Great Depression. So he's highlighting how we are cooperating, and the European Union has played an important role, but this is over 15 years ago. And the Lisbon strategy is supposed to be a strategy adopted in Lisbon, Portugal, the capital of Portugal, right? I guess when Portugal was holding the presidency of the Council of the European Union to reduce unemployment, particularly among young people. Okay, so by the way, that was interesting about how he made reference to the International Monetary Fund playing an important role in the in addressing the Greek sovereign debt crisis. Um, but also, of course, and it was successful in being addressed, right? I mean, I don't have it here right now, but of course, Greece is able to sell bonds on the international financial markets. It's bonds to borrow money to cover its budget deficit at the same interest rates as pretty much everybody else in the European Union member states, right? So about 3%. They have to offer 3% profitable return, which is not like the same as Italy, for example. So again, typically, as an important point to highlight is that the European Union, when it achieves successes, it's not really getting enough credit on the media because success means non-conflict. Success means progress. Success means there's not the threat of catastrophe. The media is drawn to danger, conflict. That's what makes headlines in the particularly in the for-profit media. If you want evidence of success, for example, that Greece is no longer in financial crisis, you don't find that as a headline in the media. You have to go and do extra research on the business and financial expert specialized media to know, for example, that just a couple years ago, 1 or 2 years ago, it was clear that Greece had succeeded in overcoming this crisis because the international financial investor community is buying Greek bonds offered by the Greek government at the same interest rates that the Italians and other countries have to sell them. So that's evidence that the financial crisis is over. It took 12 years, 12, 13, 14 years, but it was a success of the European Union. with the help of the United States, of course. Now, Donald Trump is president. Now the Europeans can't expect help from the United States in the form of the International Monetary Fund from carrying out those helping in future financial crises, right? Maybe they won't need it. But by the way, of course, I also showed you in that video before we started class today, Margaret Thatcher highlighting about a humiliating, embarrassing episode in the viewpoint of British nationalism that the United Kingdom actually had to go to the IMF for a loan because Britain had its own financial crisis in the 19, I think it was the 1960s. So let me go back here to, of course, I've always got to remember to stop the share. Well, let's go here to, let me see, IMF crisis, UK, all right, UK. So uh, UK financial crisis, see, UK IMF crisis, UK international, let me see, I'm looking here at Wikipedia, monetary fund. Uh, uh, Yeah, here it goes. Okay, so let me go here. Yeah, oh, it's 76. So if I go back here now, I'll go back to Zoom. And the reason I mention is because, of course, Koreans will all tell you about how Korea faced its own crisis with the International Monetary Fund in the late 1990s, right? And of course, before the students were born, our students in Korea were born, but they know about it because it was a big shock to the Korean economy and Korea had to borrow money from the International Monetary Fund. And it really made a big impact on Koreans because even our students that are in our class from Korea, they know about this, even though, of course, it happened before they were born. But there was also a debt crisis in Britain in the 1970s where investors had to became doubtful about the ability of the British to continue to pay their own debt obligations by selling British bonds. I think they're called in Britain, they're called gilts, is what they call their bonds. They're called gilts. And and so it says here in 1976, investors later became wary of the value of the sterling, causing the value of the pound to become very low against the dollar. And they had to go to the IMF. Now, this was a big impact, like the 1997-98 financial crisis in Korea. This had shocking impact on the British because the British, of course, now, from the perspective of social identity theory, Britain was like a developing country. It had to go to the IMF and get a loan because it was not able to maintain a stable currency value and money. It couldn't control and maintain control over its financial system, and it had to go to the IMF and get a loan. And oh my gosh, it was such a shock, and it showed how much the British had fallen since their time when they were the greatest power, economic power, at least in the 19th century, and continued to dominate the world financial system until maybe World War II, let us say, maybe at least into the 20th century. And that was the biggest shock that Britain was not one of the major shocks to British collective national psyche, national psychology that, oh my God, we're a weak, pathetic, second-rate at best power in the world. Um, and um, and of course, you saw Margaret Thatcher make a statement reference to that, right, in her speech that I was showing you before the class started, that the Labour Party, I'm sorry, the political leaders in the 1970s, they let Britain fall into such conditions that the British had to go to the International Monetary Fund and get a loan. And of course, she of course reflects this pride in Britain making Britain a respectable great power again through strong, stern economic measures that included privatizing so much of state-controlled economy and industries in Britain that had been private, that had been nationalized, that had been taken over by the British government during and after the Second World War. So British Steel, British coal companies, British steel companies, the British airline used to be state-owned, British many different companies that had been taken, the government had taken oversight control over in order to try to control and better the economy for the betterment of the working classes, particularly after the sacrifices of the Second World War. And of course that was blamed for Britain's economic weakness, culminating in this problem when Britain actually had to go to the IMF in the 1970s and get a loan because there was terrible budget deficits and taxes and lots of labor strikes and labor unrest and I remember this. Of course, I was in school when this was going on. So but of course, as I told you, for the Conservative Party people today, and since you're writing a paragraph on Brexit for Thursday, right? This was all evidence of the failure of the Labour Party and socialism more generally, and that Margaret Thatcher supposedly had the will, and she was the Iron Lady that was going to force through these changes that caused tremendous socioeconomic dislocation. I mean, I think there were tens of thousands, maybe I can't remember the number, how many tens of thousands of coal miners that were working in coal mines in Britain, and they were not profitable. They had to be subsidized with British government subsidies as part of the British budget, national budget, to subsidize these coal mines to keep them in business because they couldn't make money enough to stay in business. And she ended all of that. She stopped all of that. And all the British coal mines went bankrupt, closed. And tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of jobs in the coal mining industry in Britain just disappeared because she refused to continue to subsidize those coal mines. And of course, there were strikes and protests, and she sent in the police, and the police rushed in, and they were fighting with the coal miners. And all these things are on YouTube. You can see clips of what she did. But of course, she was the Iron Lady, right? Supposedly. So so of course. Uh, uh, and of course, so now, of course, this rise in British nationalism led to Euroscepticism that was so strong, has always been strongest in Britain for a lot of reasons, including the fact that the British, had obviously different historical experiences than the French or the Germans, or you see Germany reunited, or the Poles or the Italians, and so historical experience makes a difference. I mean, of course, these countries have very bad experience with nationalism. Italian nationalism gave us fascism and Mussolini, and German nationalism gave us Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and French nationalism, appeared to, gave you World War I, and then of course there was, I mean, it was obviously a different experience in France, but for the British, the British, they have not had this experience of being humiliated in European affairs by defeat in war since any time, right? Going back to Napoleon, they claimed that they were on the winning side, right? So that historical experience makes a difference. Now, of course, as we said in class, nationalists are more likely to make mistakes about overestimate what they're politically capable of doing, right? So the British economy now is in big trouble. They're all in trouble, but the British economy has its own troubles. And so I wanted to show you, for example, an article from the Guardian newspaper highlighting how Brexit was a mistake, and Brexit, if I can find it here, yes, here it, of course. Now the Guardian is very anti-Brexit. It's very pro-European Union. This is from yesterday or day before yesterday in the opinion side about Brexit being a mistake. And you see here now Nigel Farage, he got in the House of Commons with his Reform Party, winning elections a year ago last July. And here you can see him speaking in the House of Commons. And now, according to public opinion surveys, he is the most popular politician in Britain, according to public opinion surveys. So if I go here, and you can see Nigel Farage's first speech in Parliament, and just to not spend any time on this, but just to show you, him finally, after all of those efforts of trying to get into the House of Commons, finally after the eighth try, he gets in, and he's speaking here. And he's saying, this House of Commons in Britain is got more people favoring remaining in the European Union than he faced in the European Parliament. He talks about his time in the European Parliament. He thinks that a lot of these people in the House of Commons, they want to bring Britain back into the European Union. They're rejoiners, he calls them. You can watch it on your own. I'm not going to play it all here. We don't have time. And then he calls for Britain to leave the European Human Rights Convention, which is the treaty that established the obligations of the countries that joined the Council of Europe. Remember, the Council of Europe is not the Council of the European Union. The Council of Europe is the older human rights organization that was set up earlier than the European Coal and Steel Committee in the late 1940s. So let's go back to Gemini here. And he says that Britain should leave the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the founding treaty, so to speak, of the Council of Europe. That if you're going to belong to the Council of Europe, which is larger than the European Union, I think it's got 56 countries. I don't know, can't remember. I can check, obviously. You have to adopt the European Convention on Human Rights, which requires you to permit asylum applications. You have to permit people to come in and apply to asylum. Of course, a lot of these are European efforts to adopt and enforce in Europe what was formalized in the United Nations Charter and United Nations human rights treaties more broadly. So he's saying we have to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. So and of course, as I told you, he's now the most popular politician in Britain today, even though his party only's got 4 or 5 seats in the House of Commons. Now, yeah, I mean, they're not going to have elections in Britain for another, 4 years until 2009. Okay. So I don't know if he's going to be that popular, and I don't know if he's going to become prime minister, but public opinion surveys say he's the most popular leader in Britain today, politician in Britain today. And he makes this speech back in July last year. And now this article comes out in the Guardian newspaper in the opinion piece here saying, yes, so the Tory party, the Conservative Party, led by a British woman who's of African ancestry, Kemi Badenoch, is now following Robert Jett, this is a British newspaper, into the Farage darkness with a pledge to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. That double dose of Brexit will sink, not save them. Of course, because Nigel Farage claims that the European Convention on Human Rights is making it too easy for immigrants to come into Britain still, because Britain can't close off its borders when people want to claim asylum. That I'm here in Britain because I'm being persecuted for my religious or political beliefs. So you've got to let me in, and you have to hear my case, and I have to stay here. I have to be allowed to stay here for a long period of time while you consider my asylum application, which, of course, you might think maybe it's really due to economic reasons that you're here in Britain, not because you're being persecuted for political and religious purposes. But no, you have to let me apply. And of course, this is, again, this anti-immigrant sentiment that is so powerful driving the Trump phenomenon in the United States. Brexit was probably the single most important factor driving the Brexit vote, was this fear of immigrants. Remember, I showed you that nasty picture of a poster from Nigel Farage's campaign supporting Brexit in 2016. So yes, so she notes here just how bad things are. Again, she says here, people need reminding of what Brexit has done. You can see she says here that on October 12th, there has to be a new entry system for British people to come into the European Union. So it's going to require that they can't stay easily in the European Union. They've got to buy a visa. They have to get and they have to pay money to enter the European Union, of course. And 46% of Britain's trade is with the European Union. Only 13% is with the Common Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It expects delays, right? She mentions that, again, it's going to become even harder to cross the border. It already is hard if you're hauling goods back and forth between Britain and the European Union. You have to file all this paperwork, monumental paperwork Brexit's made hauliers take with every pallet of products they're shipping back and forth. It says Now, people go on vacation to Europe, like you're taking children to France or Spain or whatever. Before they could just get on the bus and sleep going through right across overnight into Europe. Now they all have to get up at 2 or 3 in the morning and be photographed, and for the little kids are on the bus. It's screwing up everything, right? In terms of reducing economic growth potential for service like truck drivers, bus drivers, and so on. It says here, yeah, of course, now it becomes more difficult to go move back and forth again because 46 of Britain's international trade is with the European Union. 30 kilometers across the English Channel. Uh, Here's the Office of Budget's assessment. It says here, our forecast have assumed that the volume of UK imports and exports will both be 15% lower than if we had remained in the European Union. That's 15% loss in trade equals to a 4% reduction in potential productivity of the UK economy. And of course, Britain's concerns are at the bottom of the concern list on the European Union because the 27 member states have to agree first among themselves. So they're not going to bargain and negotiate with the United Kingdom. That's not going to be their first that's not going to be the first concern. It's getting all 27 member states to agree. Because Britain's not in the European anymore, it's at the bottom of the priority list. So just to show you, these concerns. But he's the most popular politician in the United Kingdom today. So and he's talking about now he wants another referendum on leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. Another referendum. Yes. Okay, that's all we have time for today. Do you have any questions? And if not, we'll have to stop there. Okay. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.